and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really pleased that so many people have come back for this 3:30 to 4:30. Like, this is the worst time in the day. What I wanted to do was keep it useful, keep it light. So I wanted to just quickly talk maybe for half an hour, maybe for 40 minutes, and then at the end finish with 4 provocative questions. And then Tom will orchestrate a fantastic discussion to try and make sense of this big question. Digital competence, what difference does it make? Now, as Tom said, half of you might remember that I spoke last year at Pop-Up 17. So really I should go through previously at Pop-Up 17. I was looking at what we talked about because I'd kind of forgotten what we talked about last year. But it was about programming in the curriculum, coding in the curriculum. And then in a nutshell, I think I was arguing we need to talk about technology in education, but we need to do it in a realistic way. And I was trying to make the argument that we don't want to fall into the usual trap of digital in education and lots of hype and this very kind of hard sell about everything's going to be transformed and disrupted. We can't be doing that. But on the other hand, we don't want to be the usual academic, cynical dismissal, everything's terrible. We can be critical, but we can be constructively critical. So that was my kind of approach from last year. And I was trying to look for anything that I'd said last year that might be useful. And there was a lot there that seemed to be kind of very obvious. But there was one of the messages we tried to talk about last year that might be useful for this year as well. And we're interested in change, and we're interested in educational change, and this big curriculum policy of digital competence and how can we make it work. And one of the things we were talking about in terms of coding in schools is that the change doesn't happen by itself. It's something that really has to be worked at. So in some ways, putting together the curriculum documents, putting together digital competence and getting everything ready to start in the autumn is the easy part. Now, the change has to be worked at. And I'm guessing that most of the work is going to have to be done by the teachers and the schools and the municipalities. So this is the big question that we have. How is this actually going to work? So I wanted to just talk through the problem, but also the opportunity, and take everything that we've talked about today, and you've had some brilliant sessions talking about all sorts of different things, from robotics to coding to making to all of these great things we can possibly do, and think about how we can combine what we want or would like to happen with what we probably can guess is likely to happen. Because we've got a lot of kind of prehistory about curriculum change and digital competence, digital literacy change. We kind of can figure out what might happen, but we also know what could happen, and then try and work out a realistic way forward. So one of the things I wanted to do was think about, from an academic point of view, I've got lots of things I can say, and this is the question I would ask as an Australian academic. How will this work? Now, I might have to change the intonation. That's kind of should be read as, how on earth is this going to work? Or how is this going to work? That's probably the right intonation. I'm from Australia. As a policy academic, I'm really interested in how digital competence is going to work. But I'm also kind of expecting it not to work, and I'm just fascinated how that's going to play out. Now, if I was a Swedish teacher, the question I would be asking myself is, how the hell can we make this work? It's not even a question, it's a statement. So I think if you put the academic perspective on digital competence with the practical perspective and put the two together, we can probably work out some really constructive ways of moving forwards, realistic ways of moving forwards. So what I wanted to do today was look at the academic research and also look at our practical experiences of digital literacy policy, curriculum change over the past 30 years. And put the two together to try and work out where we can go next. Now, you would hope that what the academic research says is pretty much the same as what we've experienced. Now, actually, it's probably not, because academics tend to kind of focus on different things, tend to be interested in asking different questions. So I think you need to look at the academic research, but you should never take academic research 100% seriously. Never ask a university for an answer about how to do things in schools, which is probably what you've learned from today and working with the Gothenburg University in particular. But they can do some useful things. Academics can be useful. There was also that idea of being a useful idiot, but academics can be useful, but also practical experience can be useful as well. And putting the two together, I think, can give us a rounded picture on what digital competence can be. So first of all, if we think about the academic perspective, there was just a few things which struck me from looking at the literature that might be worth talking about in terms of what research can tell us. And I'm really interested in education policy. That's one of my research interests. So for the past 25 years, I've been looking at how policies to get digital curriculum and digital technologies into schools have worked out. And I've talked to policymakers and done research and documentary analysis. I'm fascinated by how policy happens or doesn't happen. So there's some really interesting stuff if we look at the policy literature that I think can help us in terms of understanding what digital competence is. So there's a whole bunch of questions that we ask about policy, but it's actually coming at this point that policy is mainly ideas. A policy is an idea. It's a set of knowledge. It's a set of ideas about something, which hopefully will make place in schools. And as soon as you see something like digital competence as an idea, you start asking some really interesting questions. What is this idea? Now, before I did the conference PowerPoint slide thing, I asked Tom and Annika, all right, I'm happy to come and talk about digital competence, but what is it? I was hoping they'd give me a really interesting, quick answer. And they kept saying, I'm not really sure. It's actually very difficult and it's all very complex. Now, we tend not to ask this what is question about policy. And in particular at digital technology, we tend to very quickly move on from asking, well, what are we actually talking about? But it's a really important question to actually ask. Because otherwise, you end up talking about something and it becomes kind of like the emperor's new clothes. So people talk about blockchain all the time now. This is the new blockchain. I don't know what a blockchain is really. And as soon as you actually say, okay, what is blockchain? All of a sudden the discussion just falls away. Now, I'm not saying digital competence is the same, but I'm really interested to think about what we actually mean by digital competence. What's the bare bones of what the digital competence curriculum actually is? What are we expecting to actually do here? What tangible difference are we setting out to achieve? And I think a really interesting question to ask here is, if digital competence is the solution, what is the problem, or what was the problem? And that hopefully gets us thinking about what we're trying to do. Now, I guess after today, you've got a really clear idea about what the digital competence is. If not, this is something we need to do straight away, is work out what we're actually trying to do here. And then there's a lot of other really interesting questions you can ask about policy. Where has this idea come from? So you've got people who've actually kind of written policy. You've got people who've kind of looked at policies. But where's this actually come from? So a lot of policy literature would often talk about policy borrowing, that these are ideas that have kind of come from elsewhere, not necessarily directly copied from other countries, but these are ideas which are floating around the ether. And in fact, Lucy was talking this morning about how we have lots and lots of digital literacy curriculum all around the world. So where has the idea of digital competence come from? And then the last two, I think, are really, really important. Who's actually pushing this idea? Who was actually behind the idea of digital competence? Who's been arguing for it? And we know that policies don't just fall from the sky. They come from people. They're lobbied. We have people who are trying to influence. So what are the agendas that have actually kind of pushed digital competence to something that actually has to be done this autumn? And what are the tensions between the different people that are pushing it? And then my final really interesting question is, what's the hidden agenda? What's the backstory to all this? Where does this actually come from? And often you find that this has nothing to do with education, nothing to do with schools, nothing to do with technology. So when you ask these questions of any digital policy, and I've done that in the US, in Australia, in Europe, in the UK, you get some really kind of recurring themes. So academic research would tell us there are some things that are probably going to happen from this policy change. First of all, something like digital competence is trying to fix some big policy problems. My hunch is that these policies are never very small scale. They're always very, very ambitious. And the trouble is they're often too ambitious. They're too big. And they lack they're not tangible enough to people to really get their teeth into. So when you look at the policies over the past 30 years, they're grand ambitions, less ground on the ground. And often the big policy problems that these policies are trying to address are not really educational problems. So I guess there's probably a lot about digital competence which relates to perhaps latest technology priorities. We need to look at cyberbullying or digital safety or fake news or AI, whatever it is. And also lots of pressures from industry and employment. We need skilled workforces to work in these particular ways in these particular industries. There's a STEM pipeline, or there's a coding shortage. So my hunch is that there are non-education agendas here. There are often, when you look at digital policies, some quite crazy ideas about education, how schools work, how much time teachers have, how much space there is in the curriculum to do these kind of things. And there are also some really unrealistic ideas about digital culture. Often these policies are not very digitally savvy. So I'm fascinated by the idea that you can somehow teach students to be aware of fake news. If you look at what fake news is, as Lucy was saying this morning, it's incredibly complex. It's not something that you can suddenly be made aware of and suddenly understand in even 3 months, let alone 3 weeks. And also, these policies tend to be very kind of supply side rather than demand driven. And by that, I mean, these are not necessarily things that teachers or students or parents or schools were asking for. There was no groundswell of demand for these changes. They just suddenly come from top down. And also, these policies tend to be driven by a real rogues gallery of interests. If you look at how some of the policies in Australia or in the UK came about, you've got Google, you've got some policy makers, you've got some school authorities, you've got a whole bunch of different actors working to push these ideas into schools. And last of all, these policies never really set out what they promised to achieve. Now, that's not to say they don't work or they don't have consequences, but they don't end up transforming education. So, if you bear in mind the policy research, the main conclusion which academics would draw is probably not a very complicated, it's probably not a very helpful one. It's really, really complicated. Now, the key aim of any academic, I would argue, is to not only say it's very complex, because anyone can say that, but it's trying to explain why things are complex and then work out how we can work with those things that make it complex. But I think it's worth thinking about from the get-go that a policy curriculum change like digital competence is an incredibly complex thing. It's not just going to happen. We're going to have to make it happen. And what we make happen won't be what we think is going to happen. So we know from 30, 40, 50 years of policy research that this isn't going to work out quite as smoothly as some people would like us to think. Now, I was asked by Annika and Tom to keep it light, keep it fun, don't get too heavy. But I thought, this is a university, for God's sake. Universities are not meant to be fun. You're in a lecture theatre. You're not meant to be enjoying yourself. You need to have some reading. You need to have some. So I wanted to just go through 3 academic names. These are 3 references you can take home. But these are 3 really interesting people that have done some excellent research on curriculum change in education. Because one of the things to remember about digital competence is this is not the first time there's been a curriculum change in school system. School systems have continually dealt with curriculum changes in every area. We know full well how this works and what happens. So whatever happens this time around, it's happened 100 times before, which means we will survive, but also we can work out what's going to happen. So there's 3 names, 3 ideas, and they're 3 really interesting ideas as well. So Jean Ainen is a sociologist of the classroom, and she did some really interesting work about what she called the difference between curriculum documents and curriculum in use. That's a really interesting kind of thing to think about digital competence. What's digital competence in use going to look like? Stephen Ball is a kind of another sociologist of education, and he's done some really interesting work on how policy is enacted. Policies don't just get implemented and then they happen. They get enacted, which is a really interesting way to think about digital competence. And last of all, Michael Fulham, who works in kind of the education, leadership, education change areas. Some of you may be familiar with him. And he's got a really interesting set of ideas about how curriculum change works as well, in terms of the compliance, the wake-up call of the policy versus the capability of the school system. Now, these are all 3 together give us some really interesting things to think about in terms of digital competence. So Jean Ainen and Stephen Ball, first of all. Jean Ainen is a really interesting sociologist that worked in the 80s, 90s, unfortunately passed away recently. But her work was looking at this idea of curriculum in use. And this is an obvious thing to say, but it's worth thinking about in terms of digital competence. That the policy text is not what actually happens in the classroom. And she did some really interesting research in how even very formal bits of the curriculum, like the math curriculum or the science curriculum, take place in very different ways in very different classrooms. And one of the interesting things from her research was how the same curriculum documents were enacted in schools in differentiated ways. So schools that were in lower socioeconomic areas, that were less resourced, had less time, tended to enact curriculum in much kind of more constrained way. So they were much more procedural and instrumental, and there was an unwillingness to actually kind of move beyond into more tricky areas. And that links to this idea of policies as texts. So something like digital competence is written down as a text now, but it will be read and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. So these things are continually being kind of reinterpreted. So in some ways, digital competence, as it's written at the moment, is not what's going to happen in schools. So what we can do here is think about how could we possibly rewrite it ourselves? Where could we rewrite it? And some of the stuff that Ainan's work and her people that work in her tradition have looked at is how the document, the text that really kind of kicks a curriculum off is not the official policy document, but a pamphlet or a blog post or something that teachers write for themselves. And that becomes the text that's circulated and used. So one of the key challenges I want us to think about is how can we write our own digital competence curriculum, and how are we going to do that? And I think everyone in this room collectively could write a really interesting version of digital competence that could be actually really, really useful. So Jean's work is really interesting. Stephen Ball's work is even more interesting, I think, because he's looked for a long time at how policy as text is actually enacted. And this idea of policies being enacted is a fascinating way to think about schools and how they have multiple demands. And when a policy actually kind of enters a school, it then gets completely kind of reworked, and schools are creatively working with policies. That's one of the key things that comes out of Ball's work. Teaching is a creative process, but actually interpreting a policy is a creative process as well. And he looks at how teachers and schools will take something like digital competence and make it into all sorts of different things. Posters, handouts, websites, curriculum documents, there's all sorts of things. And he talks about two stages, interpretation and translation. And policy interpretation is probably what we're going through now with digital competence. 2018 is the first chance we get to really look at this, an initial reading of the policy, an initial making sense of it. And this is kind of what an event like this would be doing. 2019, 2020, 2021, that's where the translation comes in. And according to Ball's work, that's where things get completely reworked, reenacted through just even the way we talk about things amongst ourselves. Even within a school, the way that we talk about digital competence, according to Ball's work, makes a huge difference to what actually happens. So again, that gives us some ideas about how we can influence that. How can we give ourselves a vocabulary to talk about digital competence in a way that actually could be really meaningful, could be really useful, could be really exciting? How can we actually begin to try and come up with resources that allow us to make the best of this opportunity? And the other thing that Ball talks about is the importance of context. And again, that's things academics always talk about, context. It's one of those words, isn't it? But this idea that there are different types of contexts that exist within schools and how these all affect something like a policy like digital competence. So he talks about situated context, and that refers to local neighbourhoods. That refers to the backgrounds of the students that you're working with, the history of the school, all of these big issue things. Professional context in terms of teacher knowledge and training and commitment. You've got material contexts, the budget, the actual school resources, the buildings, and external contexts as well, in terms of the municipality support or broader kind of pressures of inspection or whatever. You put them all together and you can kind of see how all of these contexts are going to shape something like digital competence. So again, we can think about the digital competence policy in terms of this idea of enactment or text. So from those two, from Einan and Ball, I would take these kind of 5 take-home messages, or even 4. I'm not a professor of numeracy, as you can tell. We need to feel free to actually enact this policy. We're not just interpreting something and repeating it. We're actually creatively reimagining it and enacting it, which I think is a really interesting way to think about digital competence. We need to get teachers to think that this is a creative process. And I think we need to get talking about digital competence as curriculum in use. And those 2 important things there. How are we actually doing this and actually sharing those experiences? And how can we avoid what Jean Ainan talks about in terms of schools that are well-resourced, schools that are in high socioeconomic areas doing fantastic versions of digital competence, and schools that are less privileged, are less well-resourced, not being able to, or having a kind of an inferior version. So I'm very, very worried that something like digital competence is not going to be the same in every school. It's going to be there's going to be big variations. So how can we avoid this idea of some schools doing better than others? And then we need to get talking about how digital competence bumps up against the contexts. How is it bumping up against professional contexts, situated contexts, material contexts? And last of all, this idea of the material context is fascinating, because Ball's work showed us how the materiality of any curriculum is really, really important. What's the stuff that's actually being created in terms of the digital competence curriculum, and how can we get involved? So that's the kind of the first two. Fullan is someone much more interesting. I thought I'd put him in just to kind of appeal to those of you that are in the leadership. I hate the kind of leadership area, because normally the stuff they say is very kind of, academics tend to look down on it because it's all very obvious stuff. But actually, I actually made myself read Sir Michael Fullan for this, and it's actually really interesting. He's very positive. He's a very kind of can-do type person. And the good news is his research shows that curriculum policy is actually the easiest type of policy to make a difference with. In terms of school change, he thinks curriculum policy can sometimes work, which is positive. And he's got this really interesting shopping list of what makes a good curriculum policy document. Curriculum documents that are clear, curriculum documents that reflect the best ideas in the areas of learning, that link together goals, outcomes, curriculum documents that refer to key instructional materials, and curriculum documents that provide sufficient flexibility for teachers, schools and districts to adapt or develop local. Now, I'm sure digital competence has all of these things. But if it doesn't, we need to really challenge ourselves to think, how can we rewrite the digital competence curriculum in a way that does this? Because there's no point moaning that we haven't got this at the moment. We can rewrite our own version of this curriculum. So that's a really interesting way to think about a kind of template for what digital competence should be. And the two other things that Fullan talks about, again, I'm sure Sweden has this in massive amounts, high quality teaching and teacher morale. Now, again, these are interesting things to think about, because particularly in terms of teacher morale, lots of Fullan's work shows that when the curriculum hits the school, it doesn't work on a wide-scale basis. So the good news is that curriculum change can happen. The bad news is it never happens on a systematic level. That good things happen, but in pockets, 2, 3, 4 schools together, never 30 schools or 300 schools. And he often points to the fact that teachers quickly become disenchanted with the policy and just switch off. And it seems like he's blaming the teachers, but when you read his work, he's actually saying that a lot of this comes down from the government and state. He says that states tend to introduce policies in a very kind of quick way, wanting a quick win, wanting things to happen, a magical solution, and then just leave schools to get on with it. So he makes this distinction between curriculum as compliance and then capacity. And his argument is that having a policy which is making school systems do something is very good. It's a wake-up call. It's a kind of kick up the arse, as we'd say in the UK. But then unless that's actually done at the right time in the right way with the right backing, it very quickly bumps up against people's capacity to do things, and then change doesn't happen. So in this respect, there's not much we can do about teacher quality, but we can think about some of those other issues. So in terms of actually making sure we've got curriculum policy documents that do the 4 things that Fullan says, we need to write our own, perhaps, or make sure that they're written in the way that he argues. And this idea about morale, I think, is really, really important. I'm sure you guys are all super excited about digital competence, particularly at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. But we need to fake it till we make it. We need to make sure that we're really enthusiastic about it, because if we're not really enthusiastic now, you sure as hell are not going to be enthusiastic in 6 months' time, and nor are your colleagues that are not here or not interested in this kind of thing. So we really need to do a bit of morale boosting about this, and also feel that we can see this as a local thing. We're not going to change the Swedish education system overnight. That's not how it works. But if we think about changes on a local basis, 2, 3, 4 schools, then perhaps we can make a difference. So in terms of academic research, I think there's quite a lot there to think about. But we should also think about experience. Now, This is the flip side. What's happened in the past? The academic stuff is kind of obvious, but it's stuff that you don't normally think about too much because we're just too busy. It's also really interesting to think about previous attempts at doing this, because Sweden's not the first country to try this, and actually this is not the first time you've tried it in Sweden either. Now, I'm not going to try and Swede-splain, is that a word? Mansplain how Swedish education works. You know, I wanted to talk about the UK, because I think the UK is, I am British, so I can talk about the UK with a bit more authority. The UK is a really interesting case study about this, because it's long been seen as a world leader in digital education. It's got a long, long history of digital literacy, digital competence initiatives since the 1980s. And as things like Brexit are showing us, it's always really, really good to learn from the mistakes that the British make. And actually, it's not really mistakes. It's more just kind of how things happen. But it's really interesting to think about. So looking at the past 30 years, I'm going to argue there's probably 4 different waves of digital competence type things that the British have tried. And they've worked out kind of slightly differently. So in 1981, the Micros in Schools scheme gave a computer to every school. This was a really radical thing, because it was Margaret Thatcher's government, and she wasn't really into giving things away for free on state money, as you might remember. And it was a really big deal. 7 years, and we had these computers, and we had Micros in Schools literacy, computer literacy programs, and there were all sorts of things. It was really, really exciting. But it wasn't compulsory. It was a persuasive policy. We were just trying to persuade people to do things by giving them nice stuff. But by 1988, they kind of realised that wasn't working. And so in a bit more of a Thatcher way, we had the national curriculum for the first time ever, actually introduced in 89, but the policy went through in 1988. And one of the interesting things about the national curriculum, which was a real radical thing to do in the UK, was that there was lots of computer-based education in there. It actually made using computers compulsory in the national. And it was a real radical proposal. And actually, if you look at the IT orders within this, and this is 1988, really, really cutting-edge stuff. And I think a lot of this is what we're trying to do today. So you've got the use of technology, computers to communicate ideas in education, to capture and interpret information, to assess critically the content and presentation of information from various sources, which is precisely what Lucy was talking about in terms of fake news. Mathematical investigations of imaginary situations and simulations. Make appropriate use of an IT system in the aesthetic activities of designing and making. This is all sounding really familiar. This is 1988. This is when I was in school. I was 14 at the time. Measure and control. And this last one, to consider and discuss some of the social changes and ethical considerations implicit in some uses of IT. I don't think that's a million miles away from what we're trying to do today. So, how did it all work out? Not fantastically. What's interesting about this is, and it was cross-curricular, this was the other thing. So there was national curriculum in science and maths and English and history, and IT was a cross-curricular skill. So these things had to happen across, does this sound familiar to you? Had to happen across the curriculum in every topic area. Now, a few things happened. These great ideas didn't fit with the idea of a national overall curriculum. The national curriculum was a real strengthening of traditional subject areas. So the idea of having something like this overlaying it just didn't work at all. There was a lack of resources for equipment, lack of resources for staff. There was a very limited view about having non-specialist teachers that could do this, that could work across the curriculum. And because the curriculum was very kind of siloed, the pressure from parents was for traditional teaching and targets and measurements. The whole thing didn't fit. And what you found with these cross-curricular areas was they became nobody's responsibility. Because the teachers in history thought, well, I can't really do that. That looks really tricky, but I'm sure they're doing it in geography. And the teachers in geography thought, well, I can't really do that, but I bet they're doing it in math. And so the curriculum research at the time referred to this as the phantom curriculum. It never happened because it was no one's responsibility. And these abstract ambitions, what also happened, the stuff that did happen was all the really functional stuff, measuring, writing essays, using a word processor. This more interesting stuff never ever happened. Now, that was 1988. It kind of fizzled away. And then in 1998, new government, new push, ICT. It wasn't computers, it was ICT. £1.8 billion in the first 6 years. We had a national agency, we had whiteboards, we had laptops. Learners had to use ICT in every subject, in every level. And the use of ICT in meaningful ways became compulsory in the curriculum. Again, it was a cross-curriculum subject. And we had network literacy this time. So it wasn't computer literacy, it was network literacy. The capacity to use networks to access resources, create resources, communicate with others. Really exciting stuff. Unfortunately, the same thing happened. The functional ICT skills began to get taught. We did have a lot of Microsoft Office, a lot of PowerPoint, a lot of Microsoft Word, even some Excel, and a lot of use of whiteboards. And the interesting stuff around the edges only took place with the enthusiastic teachers. So people were making things, they were creating, they were being critical, but only in pockets. And again, digital literacy didn't chime with the overall. Teachers had a lot more else to be getting on with than this. And schools also reported they didn't have capacity to. And again, because this wasn't a central part and didn't fit with everything, it just dwindled away over the 2000s. And that's when I got into academia. So this was really depressing. So I'd chosen to do research into education technology, and this whole dream had died. But in 2008, they got together, a new body of academics and industry people, the Byron Report, and by March 2010, we had a new curriculum, digital literacy, teaching critical thinking for our digital world. So it's now digital literacy, computers, ICT, digital literacy. And we had some really interesting plans, curriculum plans. Again, have a look at this. Digital literacy is a combination of functional technology skills, critical thinking, collaboration skills, social awareness. Again, is this all sounding familiar? The ability to analyse and evaluate digital information, knowing how to act sensibly, safely and appropriately online, understanding how, when, why and with whom to use technology. This was actually looking really, really good. Really felt like we were getting somewhere. Now, this was March 2010. In April 2010, we had an election, and then a coalition government got in. And in April 2010, that government decided to get rid of BECTA, which was the agency that did ICT, to get rid of the new curriculum and get back to basics. This was the austerity. So one of the first things that the education minister did was say, we're going to get rid of this. This is a complete waste. What I'm going to do is give a Bible to every school, King James Bible, and the Secretary of State even wrote a foreword to the Bible and had this on the spine. And he argued, we've been wasting time on teaching kids to use PowerPoint and ICT. We should recover something of the Victorian earnestness which believed that an audience would be gripped more profoundly by a passionate hour-long lecture and a gifted thinker rather than cheap sensation and easy pleasures. No ICT. Now, the Minister for Education at the time was Michael Gove, who you might remember a couple of years ago was headed up the Brexit Leave campaign. So, the moral of the story is, it's a funny old world, isn't it? In 1981, we were giving a computer to every school. In 2011, we were giving schools Bibles. Now, it's a really good idea to give a King James Bible to every school. It's the foundation for literature and the culture, and you should give a Quran to every. I've not got a problem with giving the Bibles to school, but it just goes to show that politics gets in the way. And I think if we're going to learn anything from the UK's example, politics is eventually going to get in the way of all of this. The functional stuff might get done. That's great. But the more interesting stuff might get lost. If anything is cross-curricular, there's a danger that it lacks focus. And there's also a danger that where the stuff takes place will be inconsistent in terms of subject area or in terms of schools. A lot of time, schools and teachers will feel they don't have the capacity, and actually it doesn't really fit with what they're trying to do elsewhere. Because digital competence is not the only thing that your schools are dealing with at the moment. There's a bunch of other stuff as well. What's interesting about all that, it might sound quite negative. I said I was going to be positive, didn't I? What's interesting about that is that stuff does happen. And if you look at the legacy of something like 1981 giving you a computer every school, you can make the argument that it did change the UK and it did introduce this computer coding problem. One of the interesting side effects of giving a computer to every school in 1981 was the chip that was developed to power this computer is called an ARM chip, ARM chip, and that's the chip that powers every smartphone that you've got in this room. It's one of the most kind of amazing inventions in the world, and it came from this. Now, that was a completely unintended consequence. That wasn't what they expected to do at all, but it did make a huge difference. So my point is, even the stuff that goes wrong has some interesting consequences, but not necessarily what we might expect. So putting the two together, the academic and the experiences, I would argue there are probably 6 things about digital competence that I would want to talk about. Policy happens in cycles. Everything comes and goes. It ebbs and flows and comes back again. So I think digital competence is a moment. We're at a moment now where things are going to go in one direction. But you need to make use of this moment because it's not going to last forever. Now, you might argue, could we turn a moment into a movement? But at the moment, it's just something that's going to take place for a kind of a finite period of time. And policy is really transitory as well. As soon as you get a government in that wants to make a change, they will get rid of this curriculum. It's the easiest thing in the world for a centre-right government to get rid of. In Australia at the moment, politicians are making big play about banning mobile phones in schools, and there's real popular support for it. So there's a big debate, should we ban mobiles in schools? I thought that was something we got sorted in 2005. I can't believe that people are still talking about it. So it's a really easy thing to say. So one of the things you need to do here is make digital competence a real political issue. Make it something that no government can get rid of. Make it something that people feel passionate about. Make it something that people feel is so important that no government will want to defund. One of the interesting things about all of those things I've talked about in terms of the ICT policies is it's not taken as seriously as proper areas of the curriculum. So no one's going to lose their job if digital competence doesn't get done properly. You probably would do if maths or literacy levels plummeted and your PISA scores fell. So in some ways, that's great because the pressure's off. But in other ways, it means that the interesting stuff is unlikely to happen because there's not really that kind of high stakes pressure. So we need to think carefully about how to make the interesting stuff happen. The curriculum and use stuff, I think, is key here. We need to make sure that schools support each other to do good things and good things get done across a system that are not just to do with inequalities. And this idea of no policy is perfect, I think, is a worth taking home message. None of this is going to work perfectly. And don't let this distract you from doing other interesting things. This isn't the be-all and end-all. So there's a real danger of overselling digital competence as we're going to do digital properly. Because if it doesn't quite work properly, you might have what's happened in the UK, whereas we now have very little interest about ICT at all, apart from programming. Because everyone just thinks, we tried that so many times, it was rubbish, we're not going to really bother again. So there's a danger that you let yourselves become oversold. Digital education is a really important area of education. So this can't be a high stakes thing that if it fails, we're never going to get around to doing it again. And then last of all policies have really interesting flip sides and unintended consequences. And I reckon the most interesting outcomes of digital competence may well be in 10 years' time, not 10 months' time. So I just wanted to finish with this amazing debate, which Tom's now going to lead, in terms of where next. What can we do? Given all that I've just told you and everything you probably knew already and everything you've talked about today, what difference can we actually make with this? So there's 2 things I want to think about and then 4 questions. I think we really need to be realistic. What can realistically be achieved here? If this lasts for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that would be brilliant. So what can we achieve in that period? Anything else would be a bonus. How can we avoid getting this kind of watered down functional version of digital competence where stuff like programming gets done, but the more interesting stuff about fake news doesn't? How can we make sure that the stuff we want to happen, all the stuff you've talked about today, robotics and making and the really cool stuff, how can we make that happen and not just end up teaching kids how to use PowerPoint 2019? And also, how can we avoid this becoming a place where inequalities arrive, where good schools get to do great things and under-resourced schools don't? Because I reckon that's what's going to happen. So those are the 2 depressing things, but here are my upbeat challenges. What can we do that's positive? How can teachers support each other in doing this? I think this has to be something now that you're doing. Like I said, this is hard work. You're now doing the work. You are not alone. You're all here together. How can we collectively do things and not just be left to our own schools and left to our own devices? How can we make this a collective moment? how can we rewrite the text, or at least make sure there are versions of the text which are useful? Surely we can do that. But by we, I mean you. I'm going after this. I've nothing to do with me at all. But I'm sure you can do stuff. And also, how can you use this as an excuse to actually do interesting things? You could do all sorts of stuff around the edges, which is quite subversive and interesting. How can that happen? And last of all, what do you want other people to do for you? There are policymakers here. There are municipalities here. There are academics at Gothenburg University Learning and IT who are desperate to help you. What do you want them to do for you? And they'll do it for free as well. Honestly, they're not going to. What do you want? How can people support you? What can we actually do to do this? So these are just 4 challenges. If you want to talk about other stuff, go for it. But what are we going to do now?
Well,
Tom, go for it.
okay. I was thinking we could start with the first question. So, och vi kan